My daughter took me to a meeting with Arab investors, but said in their language, "Don't look at my mother's rags. She is just a useless old woman." I smiled and replied fluently, "Some people don't value what they have." My daughter went ghost white. But when the sheik, who was facing away, turned around slowly and realized who I was, he kissed the hem of my dress and did something no one expected. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Evelyn, and at 63 years old, I thought I had seen enough of life's cruelties to be prepared for anything. I was wrong. Nothing could have prepared me for the moment my own daughter looked at a room full of distinguished Arab investors and spoke words that cut deeper than any blade ever could. "Don't look at my mother's rags. She is just a useless old woman." The words hung in the air like poison, spoken in Arabic with the casual dismissiveness one might use to discuss the weather. Zaidi thought I couldn't understand her. She had always assumed that her mother, the woman who had raised her single-handedly for 25 years, was nothing more than an ignorant retiree who spent her days watching television and tending to a small garden. I stood there in the marble-floored conference room of the Meridian Tower, wearing my best navy dress, the one I had carefully pressed that morning, hoping to make a good impression. My hands trembled slightly as I clutched my worn leather purse, the same one I had carried for nearly a decade. To anyone looking at me, I suppose I did appear exactly as Zaidi had described, an elderly woman out of place among the polished executives and wealthy investors. The meeting had been Zaidi's idea. As the founder of what she proudly called a boutique consulting firm, she had been courting these particular investors for months. The deal, she had explained to me over dinner 3 weeks ago, could set her up for life. $20 million in funding for her tech consulting business, with promises of expansion into the Middle Eastern market. "I want you there, Mom," she had said, though her tone suggested obligation rather than desire. "It shows family values. These Arab businessmen appreciate that." I had agreed, of course. Despite our strained relationship, despite the years of subtle condescension and barely concealed embarrassment she felt about my modest lifestyle, she was still my daughter. When your child asks for your support, you show up. But standing there as she spoke those words in Arabic, describing me as worthless debris to be ignored, I felt something inside me break. Not just my heart. That had been broken and mended so many times over the years. This was something deeper. The final thread of hope that perhaps, someday, Zaidi might see me as more than just a burden. The lead investor, a man Zaidi had introduced as Sheik Hassan al-Rashid, stood with his back to us, gazing out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city skyline. He was younger than I had expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. 2 other men flanked him, their expensive suits and careful postures marking them as his advisors or associates. Zaidi continued her presentation, her voice bright with false confidence. "As you can see from our projections, we're positioned to dominate the emerging markets you're interested in. Our algorithms can process data streams in real time, providing insights that traditional firms simply cannot match." She gestured enthusiastically at the charts displayed on the wall-mounted screen, numbers and graphs that I knew she had worked on for weeks. My daughter was brilliant. I had always known that. She had graduated summa cum laude from Stanford, built her business from nothing, spoken at conferences around the world. But brilliance, I had learned, was not the same as wisdom. One of the Sheik's advisors whispered something in Arabic, and I caught every word. "The old woman seems uncomfortable. Perhaps we should ask her to wait outside." That was when something stirred within me, something I thought I had buried decades ago. The part of me that had once walked into rooms where powerful men made decisions that affected the lives of millions. The part that had learned to speak not just with words, but with presence. I stepped forward, my voice clear and steady as I replied in fluent Arabic. "Some people don't value what they have." The effect was immediate and electric. Zaidi's face went completely white, her mouth falling open in shock. The advisors straightened, surprise flickering across their carefully controlled expressions, but it was Sheikh Hassan's reaction that made my heart pound. He turned around slowly, as if he had heard a voice from beyond the grave. When his eyes met mine, I saw recognition dawn across his features like the sunrise. His face transformed from polite business interest to something approaching awe. "It cannot be," he whispered, also in Arabic, his voice barely audible. I smiled, the same diplomatic smile I had perfected in countless negotiations, in rooms where the wrong word could mean war or peace. "Hello, Hassan. You've grown up." The Sheik's hands trembled as he raised them to his heart in a traditional gesture of respect. Then, to everyone's absolute shock, this powerful man who commanded billions of dollars and influenced governments across the Middle East dropped to one knee and kissed the hem of my navy dress. "My lady," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "my family's savior." Zaidi made a strangled sound, stepping backward until she bumped into the conference table. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the confusion and growing horror on her face as she watched her useless old mother being revered like royalty by the very man she had been trying to impress. "I don't understand," she stammered, switching back to English. "Mom, what is happening? How do you know each other?" Sheikh Hassan rose gracefully, his eyes never leaving my face. When he spoke, his English was accented but precise. "Your mother, Miss Morrison, is a legend. A woman who risked everything to save lives when the world was turning away." The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic 40 floors below. I could feel my daughter's stare boring into me, demanding explanations I wasn't sure I was ready to give. For 30 years, I had been just Mom, the woman who packed her lunches, attended parent-teacher conferences, and worked night shifts at a hospital to pay for her education. "Hassan," I said quietly, "that was a very long time ago." "Not long enough for gratitude to fade," he replied. "Without you, I would not be standing here today. None of us would." One of his advisors, a man with graying temples and intelligent eyes, stepped closer. "Forgive me, but are you saying this lady is Evelyn Morrison? The Evelyn Morrison who coordinated the Damascus evacuations?" The question hung in the air like a revelation waiting to explode. I saw Zaidi's confusion deepen, her eyes darting between the men and me as if trying to solve a puzzle where all the pieces had suddenly changed shape. I had spent decades hiding in plain sight, letting the world forget what I had once been capable of. But standing there, seeing the respect and reverence in these men's eyes, I remembered why I had fallen in love with diplomatic work in the first place. It wasn't about the power or the prestige. It was about the moments when you could change someone's life with the right words, the right connection, the right amount of courage. "Yes," I said simply. "I am Evelyn Morrison." The words felt strange after so many years of introducing myself as just Zaidi's mom, or Mrs. Morrison from apartment 12B. But they also felt like coming home. Sheikh Hassan placed his hand over his heart again. "Then I must tell you that my family has been searching for you for 25 years. The silence that followed Sheikh Hassan's words felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane. I could see Zaidi's world tilting on its axis, her carefully constructed understanding of who her mother was crumbling piece by piece. The woman she had just described as a useless old woman was apparently someone these powerful men had been actively seeking for 2.5 decades. "Searching for me?" I asked, though my diplomatic training had already provided several possible answers. In my previous life, I had learned that gratitude in the Middle East was not a fleeting emotion. It was a debt that passed from generation to generation. Sheikh Hassan gestured to his advisors, and I noticed how they immediately stepped back, giving him space to speak privately. Even in this moment of personal revelation, the man commanded absolute respect. "When I was 7 years old," he began, his voice carrying the weight of memory, "my family was trapped in Damascus during the siege of 1992. My father was a minor diplomat, caught on the wrong side of a political uprising that threatened to tear the country apart. We had 48 hours to evacuate or face imprisonment, or worse. I remembered that time all too well. The calls that came in the middle of the night, the frantic coordination between embassies, the impossible choices between saving some and leaving others behind. Those were the days when sleep was a luxury and every decision carried the weight of human lives. The official channels had failed us, Hassan continued. The American embassy had already evacuated non-essential personnel. The British were overwhelmed. We were told to wait, to hope for the best. And then a woman appeared at our door. I felt Zaidie's eyes burning into me, but I kept my focus on Hassan. Some stories needed to be told completely before the questions could begin. She spoke perfect Arabic, knew the back routes through the city that even locals had forgotten. She had a network of contacts that seemed impossible for any one person to maintain. In 36 hours, she had us on a plane to safety, along with 14 other families who had been written off as lost causes. Hassan paused, his hand moving unconsciously to his chest, where I could see the outline of what was probably a pendant or chain beneath his shirt. My father spent the rest of his life trying to find this woman. He knew only her first name, Evelyn. No last name, no official title, no government agency to contact. She had appeared like an angel and vanished just as mysteriously. The advisor with the graying temples stepped forward slightly. Sir, if I may add, my own family was among those saved that day. The Al-Mahmoud family. I did remember them. The elderly patriarch who had refused to leave without his books. The pregnant daughter-in-law who went into labor during the evacuation. We had delivered that baby in the back of a relief truck while shells exploded 3 blocks away. Ahmad al-Mahmoud, I said quietly, and watched the man's eyes widen with shock. You remember my father's name, he whispered. Of course I remembered. You don't forget the names of people whose lives hang in the balance of your decisions. Even 30 years later, I could still recall the weight of that newborn baby in my arms. The relief on his grandmother's face when we reached the safe zone. Zaidie finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. Mom, I don't understand any of this. You worked at Memorial Hospital. You were a nurse. You told me you were just a nurse. I turned to look at my daughter, seeing her properly for perhaps the first time in years. Not as the successful businesswoman she had become, not as the child I had raised, but as someone trying to reconcile 2 completely different versions of reality. I was a nurse, I said gently. That part was true, but it wasn't the only truth. Sheikh Hassan moved closer, his voice dropping to a more private tone. Miss Morrison, may I ask why you disappeared? After the evacuations, after saving so many families, you vanished from the diplomatic world entirely. We heard rumors that you had died, that you had been reassigned, that you had been recruited by intelligence agencies. But no one knew for certain. The real answer was both simpler and more complicated than any of those rumors. I had disappeared because I fell in love, because I got pregnant, because I chose to build a life instead of saving lives, at least in the way I had been trained to do. I got married, I said simply. Had a baby. Decided that my family needed me more than the State Department did. It was the abbreviated version, of course. I didn't mention how my husband David had grown increasingly uncomfortable with my long absences, the phone calls at all hours, the way I would disappear for weeks at a time on consulting assignments that I couldn't discuss. I didn't mention the ultimatum he had given me when Zaidie was 2 years old. Choose your career or choose your family. I had chosen my family. And when David died in a car accident 8 years later, leaving me to raise Zaidie alone, I had never looked back. The State Department had offered me positions, consulting work, chances to return to the world I had loved. But Zaidie needed stability, needed a mother who would be present for parent-teacher conferences and soccer games and teenage heartbreaks. So I became a hospital nurse, working night shifts so I could be available during the day. I buried my languages, my contacts, my years of experience in international relations. I became exactly what Zaidie had always known me to be. Just mom. You gave up everything, Ahmad al-Mahmoud said, and I could hear the awe in his voice. A career that could have changed the world. Before I could respond, the conference room door opened and 3 more men entered. I recognized the type immediately, the bearing of military training softened by years in business, the careful way they scanned the room before focusing on the key players. Sheikh Hassan straightened, and I caught the subtle shift in his demeanor from personal to professional. "Gentlemen, perfect timing. I would like you to meet someone very special." The newcomers approached, and I felt that familiar tingle of recognition that came from years of reading people, understanding power dynamics, anticipating how conversations would unfold. These weren't just more investors. These men carried themselves with the authority of people who made decisions that affected nations. "This is Evelyn Morrison," Hassan said, his voice carrying a reverence that made Zaidi flinch visibly. "The woman who saved my family 30 years ago. The woman who saved many of our families." The tallest of the three men stepped forward, and when he spoke, his accent was different. Lebanese, I thought. "Mrs. Morrison, I am Khalil Rashid. My sister Amira speaks of you often." Amira. The 12-year-old girl who had been separated from her family during the chaos, who I had found 3 days later in a refugee camp, traumatized and alone. I had spent 2 weeks with her family, helping them process immigration papers, teaching Amira English phrases that would help her communicate with aid workers. "How is Amira?" I asked, and saw tears form in his eyes. "She is Dr. Amira Rashid now, chief of pediatric surgery at American University of Beirut. She named her daughter Evelyn." The room seemed to spin slightly. In all my years of quiet retirement, I had wondered about the families I had helped, the children who had grown up far from the chaos we had pulled them from. But I had never imagined that my name had been passed down, that these brief intersections in our lives had meant so much to them. Zaidi made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. When I looked at her, I saw that her carefully applied mascara was starting to smudge. "How many?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "How many families?" Sheikh Hassan exchanged a glance with his colleagues. "In Damascus alone, 47 families. 312 people." But Damascus was not the only operation. The room fell silent again, but this time it felt different. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of reverence. I found myself remembering other cities, other crises, other faces. Sarajevo in 1994, Rwanda later that same year. The endless succession of places where politics and hatred created human suffering, and where sometimes, if you knew the right people and asked the right questions, you could create a small pocket of safety in the chaos. "Mrs. Morrison," said the third newcomer, "I represent a consortium of families whose lives you touched during those years. We have been hoping to find you for a very long time." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "For what purpose?" "To thank you, of course, and to offer you something that should have been offered 30 years ago." I caught Zaidi's sharp intake of breath, saw her eyes widen as she began to understand that this conversation was moving in a direction she had never anticipated. Her mother, the woman she had brought along as a family obligation, was about to become the center of attention in ways she could never have imagined. Sheikh Hassan reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope, thick and expensive-looking. "Mrs. Morrison, we would be honored if you would consider a position with the Al-Rashid Foundation. We work with refugee resettlement, crisis intervention, and international humanitarian coordination." The irony was not lost on me. Here was my daughter, desperately seeking $20 million in funding for her technology consulting firm, while these same investors were about to offer her useless old mother a chance to return to the world she had left behind. "What kind of position?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "Director of Crisis Operations," Hassan said. "Full autonomy, unlimited budget for humanitarian projects, and a salary that reflects the value of your experience." He handed me the envelope. "The details are all in here, but I can tell you that the annual compensation is $2.5 million, plus housing, travel, and full support staff." The envelope felt heavier than paper had any right to feel. Zaidi was staring at it as if it contained a live bomb. I looked up at these men, some of whom I had known as children, others who had grown up hearing stories of the woman who had helped their families escape chaos. They were offering me a chance to reclaim the life I had set aside, to use the skills I had buried, to make a difference in the world again. But first, I had to deal with my daughter, whose entire worldview had just been shattered in the space of 20 minutes. The envelope sat on the conference table between us like a piece of evidence in a trial I hadn't known I was attending. Zadie's eyes kept darting to it, then to me, then to the men who surrounded us with the kind of reverence usually reserved for heads of state or religious figures. "I need to sit down," Zadie said suddenly, her voice hollow. She reached for one of the leather chairs, her legs seeming unsteady. Sheikh Hassan immediately gestured for one of his assistants, who quickly poured a glass of water from the crystal pitcher on the side table. "Of course, please. Make yourself comfortable. This must be quite overwhelming." Overwhelming. That was one way to put it. I watched my daughter accept the water with trembling hands, and I felt a familiar ache in my chest, the same one I had carried for 30 years, wondering if I had made the right choice in walking away from my career to be the mother she needed. "Mrs. Morrison," said Khalil Rashid, his voice gentle but persistent. "Perhaps you could tell us what happened after Damascus? We lost track of you completely." I remained standing, partly out of old habit. In diplomatic circles, you never sat unless invited, and you never sat first, and partly because something about this moment felt too significant for the casual intimacy of sitting around a conference table. "I came home," I said simply, "to Washington, D.C. My daughter was 2 years old, my husband was threatening divorce, and I realized that I couldn't save every family in the world if I couldn't save my own." The truth was more complicated than that, of course. It always was. David had given me an ultimatum during one of my brief returns from what was officially called humanitarian consulting. He had stood in our kitchen, holding Zadie in his arms, and said words that still echoed in my memory. "Choose, Evelyn. Choose us or choose them. But you can't choose both anymore." "Your husband," Ahmad al-Mahmoud said carefully, "he was not supportive of your work?" I glanced at Zadie, who was listening with the intensity of someone hearing a foreign language being translated for the first time. "David was a good man," I said, which was true. "But he married a nurse, not a diplomat. When the State Department started calling me for increasingly dangerous assignments, when I started being away for months at a time, he felt like he was losing his wife to a world he couldn't understand." What I didn't say was how David had found my emergency passport hidden in our bedroom, along with documentation under 3 different names. How he had confronted me about the scars on my back that I had told him came from a childhood accident, when they were actually from a kidnapping incident in Somalia that had gone wrong. How he had slowly pieced together that the woman he had married was not the woman sleeping in his bed. "So you left the diplomatic service," Sheikh Hassan said, and I could hear the question beneath the statement. "I was never officially in the diplomatic service," I replied. "Officially, I was a civilian contractor, humanitarian aid coordination. But yes, I left it all behind." The 4th man, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "Mrs. Morrison, my name is Omar Al-Zahra. I represent the families from the Sarajevo evacuations of 1994. My breath caught. Sarajevo had been different from Damascus. In Damascus, we had been racing against time, but working with some measure of official support. In Sarajevo, we had been working completely outside normal channels, using networks that existed in the gray areas between legitimate diplomacy and what some might call espionage. "The Al-Zahra family," I said, remembering. "Your father was the university professor." "Yes. And your mother was pregnant with me when you helped them escape the siege." I felt the familiar weight of those memories settling on my shoulders. Sarajevo in 1994 had been a nightmare of sniper fire and artillery bombardments. The family had been trapped in the academic quarter for 8 months, surviving on UN rations and what little food could be smuggled through the tunnels. "You carried me out yourself," Omar continued. "When my mother went into premature labor during the evacuation, you made the decision to stay with her instead of leading the other families to safety." Zadie's water glass slipped from her fingers, clattering against the table. "You were in war zones?" she whispered. "While I was a baby, you were in war zones?" The question hit me like a physical blow. This was exactly what I had hoped to avoid, exactly why I had buried those years so completely. The guilt that came with knowing that while I was crawling through bombed-out buildings to save strangers, my own daughter was being cared for by babysitters and daycare workers. Sometimes, I said quietly, when there was no other choice. No other choice? Zadie's voice was rising, and I could see 30 years of resentment beginning to crystallize into something harder and more dangerous. You had a choice. You had a daughter. You chose strangers over your own child. The accusation hung in the air like a slap. Around us, the Middle Eastern businessmen shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that they had stumbled into a family drama that went far deeper than they had anticipated. Sheikh Hassan cleared his throat delicately. Perhaps we should give you both some privacy to discuss. No, I said firmly. If we're going to do this, we do it now. All of it. I turned to face Zadie directly, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Not as my successful daughter who had grown beyond needing me, but as the little girl who had asked why Mommy was always working, why Mommy sometimes came home with bruises, why Mommy cried in the bathroom when she thought no one was listening. You're right, I said. I made choices that took me away from you, but you need to understand why. I reached into my purse and pulled out something I had carried for 30 years, but never shown her. A small photograph, worn at the edges from handling. It showed a group of children, maybe 20 of them, standing outside a refugee camp tent. They were holding a banner that read, "Thank you, Miss Evelyn," in Arabic. This was taken in 1993, I said, handing the photo to Zadie. 3 months after Damascus. Those children are all alive today because of what we did. They have families now, careers, lives that wouldn't have existed if we had left them behind. Zadie stared at the photo, and I saw her hands trembling again. Hassan was the little boy in the front row, I continued, the one holding the banner. He was 7 years old and had been separated from his parents for 6 weeks. When we found them, he hadn't spoken a word since the separation. Post-traumatic stress, the doctor said. He might never recover. Sheikh Hassan stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. She worked with me for 3 hours every day for 2 weeks, teaching me English words, helping me understand that my parents were safe. The first word I spoke after the trauma was her name, Evelyn. I saw tears forming in Zadie's eyes, but her jaw remained set in stubborn anger. That's very touching, she said, her tone brittle. But it doesn't change the fact that you chose them over me. Every time. I chose them because you were safe, I replied. You had a home, food, medical care, a father who loved you. These children had nothing except the hope that someone would care enough to risk everything to save them. Omar Al-Zara moved closer, his voice gentle but insistent. Miss Morrison, perhaps you don't understand the full scope of what your mother accomplished. The Sarajevo operation alone saved over 200 people, but that was just one of many. He gestured to his colleagues. Between 1990 and 1996, your mother coordinated evacuations in 8 different countries. She is personally responsible for saving over 1,500 lives. The number hit Zadie like a physical blow. I watched her face go pale as she processed it. 1,500 people, she repeated numbly. 1,500 people who went on to have children of their own, Ahmad al-Mahmoud added. Who built businesses, became doctors and teachers and engineers, who contributed to their new communities in ways that rippled outward for generations. Khalil Rashid pulled out his phone and scrolled through what appeared to be a contact list. Would you like to see what some of those children grew up to become? Dr. Amira Rashid, as I mentioned, but also Professor Hassan al-Mahmoud at Georgetown University. Engineer Layla Qasim, who designed water purification systems now used throughout the Middle East. Architect Samir Qasemi, whose refugee housing designs have been implemented by the UN. He looked up at Zadie. Your mother didn't just save lives, she saved potential, dreams, entire family trees that wouldn't have existed without her intervention. I watched my daughter struggle with this information, saw her trying to reconcile the woman she had always known with the person these men were describing. The mother who had worked night shifts at the hospital to pay for her private school education was also someone who had been trusted with international crisis operations that most people would never even know had happened. Why didn't you tell me? Zadie asked finally, her voice breaking. Why let me think you were just ordinary? The question I had been dreading for 30 years. The one I had hoped she would never ask. Because I wasn't sure I had a good answer. Because I wanted you to be proud of me for being your mother, I said simply. Not for being someone who had done extraordinary things before you were born. I wanted you to love me for who I was with you, not for who I had been without you. Sheikh Hassan stepped forward, his expression serious. Mrs. Morrison, there is something else you should know. Something we discovered only recently, through our research into your background. I felt a cold dread settling in my stomach. There were parts of my past that I had hoped would stay buried forever. The State Department files from your final assignment, Hassan continued carefully. They were declassified last year under the 30-year rule. We learned that your decision to leave diplomatic work was not entirely voluntary. Zadie's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face suddenly alert. What does that mean? Hassan looked at me, clearly asking permission to continue. I nodded slowly, knowing that this conversation had already gone too far to stop now. Your mother's final assignment was Somalia in 1996, he said. She was captured by militants while trying to evacuate a group of aid workers, held for 17 days, tortured. The word hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. When she was finally rescued, Hassan continued, the State Department offered her full medical support, psychological counseling, and a promotion to Deputy Director of Crisis Operations. She turned it all down. Disappeared from their records completely. I felt Zadie's stare burning into me, but I couldn't meet her eyes. Those 17 days in Somalia were a chapter of my life I had never told anyone about, not even David. You were tortured, Zadie whispered. And then you came home and made me breakfast and helped me with my homework. You were 3 years old, I said, my voice barely audible. You didn't need to know that monsters existed. The conference room fell silent except for the sound of Zadie's quiet sobbing. 30 years of resentment and misunderstanding were crumbling around us, leaving behind something raw and painful, but perhaps, finally, honest. Oh God, Zadie said through her tears. What kind of daughter have I been? The silence that followed Zadie's question felt like stepping into a cathedral, heavy with the weight of confession and forgiveness. I watched my daughter crumble in her chair, her polished professional facade completely destroyed by the revelation of who her mother really was. Or rather, who her mother had been. What kind of daughter have I been? She repeated, her voice barely a whisper. I called you useless, in front of these men whose families you saved. I was ashamed of you. I moved toward her instinctively, the way I had when she was small and needed comfort after a nightmare or a scraped knee. But she held up a hand, stopping me. No, she said firmly, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. Don't you dare comfort me right now. I don't deserve it. Sheikh Hassan cleared his throat gently. Perhaps we should postpone our discussion. No, Zadie said, straightening in her chair with what I recognized as the stubborn determination she had inherited from me. I need to hear all of it. Everything. She looked at the men surrounding us, these powerful businessmen who had dropped everything to honor a woman they saw as a hero. Tell me about Somalia. Tell me what my mother went through while I was playing with dolls and complaining that she worked too much. Omar Al-Zahra glanced at me uncertainly. Mrs. Morrison, this is very personal information. Tell her, I said quietly. If we were finally having this conversation, it needed to be complete. No more secrets, no more protection from ugly truths. Zadie was 38 years old. She could handle knowing who her mother really was. Omar nodded solemnly. The operation in Somalia was supposed to be a simple evacuation. A group of Doctors Without Borders workers had been caught in crossfire between government forces and rebels. Your mother was sent in with a small team to extract them safely. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But intelligence was wrong. The rebels were not interested in ransom or negotiation. They were making a statement about Western interference in African conflicts. The medical team and your mother's extraction team were captured on the second day. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that came whenever these memories surfaced. Even 30 years later, even with decades of therapy and meditation and determined forgetting, Somalia remained the darkest chapter of my life. The official reports were heavily redacted, Ahmad Al-Mahmoud continued. But through our family connections, Some of us have relatives in intelligence services. We learned more details. Mrs. Morrison was tortured for information about American operations in the region. When she refused to provide any intelligence, they tortured her to break her spirit, to prove that American operatives were not as strong as they pretended to be. Zadie's face was completely white now. How long? 17 days, I answered before anyone else could. 17 days and 16 nights. And you never told me. Never told anyone. What would have been the point? I asked, genuinely curious about her answer. What would telling you have accomplished except to give you nightmares about things you couldn't change or control? Khalil Rashid leaned forward, his expression grave. Mrs. Morrison, there is something else about Somalia that you may not know. Something we discovered through our investigation. I felt my stomach drop. There were things about Somalia that I had never told anyone, things that the State Department had classified so deeply that even I wasn't supposed to know all the details. The medical team you were trying to extract, Khalil continued carefully. They included my cousin, Dr. Fatima Rashid. She was working with Doctors Without Borders, providing surgical care to civilians caught in the conflict. The name hit me like a physical blow. Fatima. The young surgeon who had been working 18-hour days in conditions that would have challenged doctors in fully equipped hospitals. I remembered her clearly. Brilliant, dedicated, refusing to abandon her patients even when the situation became obviously dangerous. Fatima didn't survive, I said quietly, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. No, Khalil agreed. She was executed on the 14th day of your captivity, shot in the head while you were forced to watch. Zadie made a choking sound. They made you watch? The memory came flooding back with brutal clarity. Fatima's last words to me. Tell my family I saved 12 children today. The sound of the gunshot. The way her body had crumpled like a discarded puppet. They wanted me to break, I said, my voice mechanical. Physical torture hadn't worked, so they tried psychological warfare. They thought watching innocent people die because of my mission would make me give them what they wanted. But you didn't break, Omar said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. Everyone breaks eventually, I replied. I was close, very close. If the rescue team had taken another day or two, I would have told them everything. Sheik Hassan moved closer, his expression intense. Mrs. Morrison, the rescue operation that saved you, do you know how it was organized? I shook my head. I was unconscious when they brought me out. Severe dehydration, broken ribs, infection from untreated wounds. I spent 3 weeks in a military hospital in Germany before I was stable enough to be debriefed. The rescue was not a government operation, Hassan said carefully. It was organized and funded by families you had saved in previous operations. When the State Department was unable to negotiate your release, we took matters into our own hands. The revelation hit me like a thunderbolt. You paid for mercenaries? We paid for the best extraction team money could buy. Ahmad al-Mahmoud corrected. $2.7 million, pooled together from 43 families whose lives you had saved. We were not going to let you die in that hellhole after everything you had done for us. I felt my legs go weak and had to sit down heavily in one of the conference chairs. All these years I had believed that my rescue had been a routine military operation. I had never known that the families I had helped had literally bought my freedom. Zadie was staring at all of us with an expression I couldn't read. You organized a private military operation to save my mother? Of course, Sheikh Hassan said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She had risked her life for our families. How could we do any less for her? And after all that, Zadie said, her voice hollow, she came home and became a night shift nurse so she could take care of me during the day. The words hung in the air like an accusation, but not against me, against herself. Your mother never told you about her injuries from Somalia, did she? Omar asked gently. Zadie shook her head, looking at me with new eyes. Permanent nerve damage in her left hand, Omar continued. 3 vertebrae in her lower back that were fractured and never properly healed. chronic pain that she managed with physical therapy and meditation because she refused to take strong painkillers while she was raising you. I saw Zadie's face crumple as she remembered all the times she had seen me rubbing my back or flexing my fingers, dismissing it as normal aging. "The scars on your arms," she whispered. "The ones you said were from accidents when you were young." "Cigarette burns," I said simply. "They wanted to know about American safe houses in Mogadishu." Zadie doubled over as if she had been punched in the stomach. "And I complained about you working too much. I resented you for not being at every school play and soccer game. I was embarrassed by your car, your clothes, the apartment we lived in after Dad died." She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. "You could have had money, status, important work. You could have been somebody." "I was somebody," I said firmly. "I was your mother. That was more important to me than anything else I had ever done or could ever do." Sheikh Hassan stepped forward with the envelope he had offered earlier. "Mrs. Morrison, perhaps now you understand why this offer is so important to us. We are not just offering you a job. We are offering you a chance to reclaim the life you sacrificed for your family." I looked at the envelope, then at Zadie, who was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "The position comes with full autonomy," Hassan continued. "You would report directly to our board of directors, which consists entirely of people whose families you saved. Your decisions would be final. Your budget would be unlimited. You would have the resources to do the kind of humanitarian work that governments are often too slow or too political to handle." Ahmad Al-Mahmoud added, "We have already identified 17 current crisis situations where your expertise could save lives immediately. Syrian refugees in Turkey, Rohingya Muslims in Bangladesh, political dissidents in Myanmar. The work you did 30 years ago is needed now more than ever." I felt something stirring inside me that I hadn't experienced in decades. The old fire, the sense of purpose that had driven me through war zones and political minefields. The feeling of being exactly where I was meant to be, doing exactly what I was born to do. But I also felt the weight of Zadie's stare, the 38 years of our complicated relationship, the knowledge that accepting this offer would mean admitting that she had been right about one thing. I had always belonged to a larger world than just the two of us. "What about your consulting business?" I asked her, nodding toward the presentations that were still displayed on the wall screen. "This meeting was supposed to be about your funding." Zadie let out a laugh that was half sob, half hysteria. "My business? My brilliant technological solutions for emerging markets?" She gestured at the men around us. "These men just offered my mother more money in a year than I make in 5. They came here to invest $20 million in a tech startup, and instead, they found a legend they've been searching for since I was 13 years old." She stood up abruptly, swaying slightly. "Do you know what the worst part is? I brought you here as window dressing. Family values," I said. "Show them we're respectable people with strong family connections." She laughed again, the sound bitter and raw. "I dragged you to this meeting as a prop, and it turns out you're the most important person in the room." Sheikh Hassan looked uncomfortable. "Miss Morrison, perhaps we should discuss—" "No," Zadie said sharply. "There's nothing to discuss. My business was built on algorithms and market analysis. But my mother built her career on saving actual human lives. There's no comparison." She picked up her purse and coat from the chair where she had left them. "Take the job, Mom. Take all of it. The money, the position, the chance to go back to being who you really are." She paused at the door, turning back to look at me one last time. "I'm sorry I never saw you. I'm sorry I was ashamed of you. And I'm sorry it took strangers to show me what an incredible woman my mother is." Then she was gone, leaving me alone with 4 of the most powerful men in the Middle East and an envelope that contained the chance to reclaim everything I had given up 30 years ago. The silence that followed Zadie's departure felt like the aftermath of an explosion. I stood frozen in the center of the conference room, the envelope still in my hands, while 4 of the most influential men in the Middle East waited for me to speak. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the city sprawling below us, Millions of people going about their ordinary lives while my world had just been turned completely upside down. Perhaps we should give you some time to process, Sheikh Hassan said gently, but I could see the concern in his eyes. He had come here expecting to make a generous offer to a woman he revered. Instead, he had inadvertently destroyed the relationship between a mother and daughter. No, I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. I think I've had enough time. 30 years, in fact. I opened the envelope and pulled out the documents inside. The offer was even more comprehensive than Hassan had indicated. Not just a salary of $2.5 million annually, but housing allowances, travel budgets, security details, full medical coverage, and a discretionary fund for emergency operations that had no upper limit. More importantly, the organizational structure they had created was exactly what I had always dreamed of during my State Department years. No bureaucratic red tape, no political considerations, no committees that could override field decisions. Just the resources to identify crises and respond immediately, with the full backing of some of the wealthiest families in the world. The Al-Rashid Foundation, I read aloud from the letterhead. Named for my family, but funded by all of us, Hassan explained. We established it 5 years ago with the specific purpose of finding you and offering you this position. When that proved impossible, we began doing the work ourselves, always hoping that someday we could convince you to lead it properly. Ahmad al-Mahmoud moved to the presentation screen and pulled up a new set of slides. These are our current operations: refugee camps in Jordan and Lebanon, medical clinics in Afghanistan, educational programs for displaced children throughout the region. But we lack the expertise to expand into crisis intervention. I studied the numbers on the screen. They had built something impressive, but I could see immediately where their limitations lay. They were excellent at providing aid after disasters had already occurred, but they had no capacity for the kind of preventive diplomacy that could stop crises before they became catastrophes. How many staff members do you currently employ? I asked, falling automatically into the analytical mindset that had once been second nature. 347 full-time employees across 12 countries, Khalil Rashid answered, plus approximately 800 contractors and local partners. Operational budget? $120 million annually. But as you can see from the offer letter, we are prepared to increase that significantly if you accept the position. I felt the familiar thrill that came with contemplating a complex logistical challenge. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a chance to build the kind of humanitarian operation that could actually make a difference on a global scale. But even as my mind began racing with possibilities, I couldn't stop thinking about Zaidi walking out that door, the way her shoulders had slumped in defeat, the realization that her entire understanding of our relationship had been based on incomplete information. What about my daughter? I asked suddenly, the words escaping before I could stop them. Omar Al-Zahra looked confused. I'm sorry? Zaidi, her business. She came here seeking funding, and instead she discovered that her mother is apparently more interesting to you than she is. What happens to her now? The men exchanged glances, and I could see that they had been so focused on their own reunion with their long-lost savior that they hadn't fully considered the collateral damage. Mrs. Morrison, Hassan said carefully, we would be happy to discuss investment opportunities with your daughter as well, but her technology consulting firm isn't really what you're interested in investing in, I finished for him. You came here for oil and gas infrastructure, defense contracts, regional development projects. Zaidi's company is too small, too specialized, too American for your needs. The uncomfortable silence that followed confirmed what I already knew. Zaidi had been chasing an impossible dream, trying to break into markets that were already dominated by established players with connections she couldn't match. However, Khalil added slowly, if she were interested in redirecting her technological expertise toward humanitarian applications, I felt a spark of hope. What do you mean? Crisis communication systems, refugee tracking databases, resource allocation algorithms. The kind of technological infrastructure that could revolutionize how humanitarian aid is delivered. He gestured toward the presentation screen. Your daughter's background in data analysis and emerging market technologies could be exactly what we need to modernize our operations. Ahmad al-Mahmoud nodded enthusiastically. We have been struggling with information management. When a crisis breaks, we often lose valuable time trying to coordinate between different agencies and governments. A comprehensive technological solution could save hundreds of lives in the first 48 hours alone. I looked at the documents in my hands, then at the men who had spent 5 years and considerable resources trying to find me. They were offering me everything I had ever wanted professionally. But they were also offering something I hadn't dared to hope for, a way to bring Zadie into this world with me, as an equal partner, rather than the daughter who had always felt secondary to my larger mission. I need to talk to her first, I said finally. Before I can accept this offer, I need to make sure that my daughter and I understand each other. Hassan nodded immediately. Of course, family comes first. We learned that lesson from you 30 years ago. I gathered my purse and coat, the envelope tucked safely inside. Give me 24 hours. I'll have an answer for you tomorrow. As I headed for the door, Omar called after me. Mrs. Morrison, your daughter was wrong about one thing. I turned back. What's that? She said she brought you here as window dressing, but we came to this meeting because we heard that Zadie Morrison was the daughter of someone named Evelyn. We have been tracking your family for years, hoping for exactly this opportunity. The revelation stopped me cold. You mean, your daughter didn't choose us as investors, Hassan said with a slight smile. We chose her because she was yours. The elevator ride down to the parking garage felt endless. My mind was spinning with everything I had learned, everything that had changed in the space of 2 hours. But underneath the excitement and the possibilities, there was a deeper current of guilt and regret. I had spent 30 years protecting Zadie from the truth about my past, believing that she was better off not knowing about the violence and danger that had shaped my early career. But in protecting her from those truths, I had also denied her the chance to understand why I had made the choices I made, why I worked nights so I could be available during her school days, why I lived modestly despite having connections that could have opened doors to wealth and influence, why I sometimes disappeared into myself, lost in memories she couldn't share. My phone buzzed with a text message as I reached my car. It was from Zadie. I'm sorry, Mom. For everything. You deserved better from me. I stared at the message for a long time before typing back. You deserved better from me, too. Can we talk? Her response came immediately. I'm at home. Please come over. The drive to Zadie's apartment in the Marina District took 45 minutes in afternoon traffic, giving me time to think about what I wanted to say. How do you explain 30 years of choices to someone who has just learned that everything they believed about your relationship was incomplete? Zadie's building was one of those converted warehouses that had been turned into expensive lofts for young professionals. I had always felt slightly out of place there, surrounded by exposed brick and industrial fixtures that cost more than most people's annual salaries. But today, as I rode the elevator up to her floor, I wondered if my discomfort had been less about the building and more about feeling like I didn't belong in the successful life my daughter had built. She opened the door before I could knock, her eyes red from crying but her expression determined. I've been thinking, she said without preamble, about everything those men said, about what you sacrificed to raise me, about how selfish I've been. I followed her into the living room, noting the expensive furniture, the original artwork, the floor-to-ceiling windows with their view of the bay. This was the life I had wanted for her. Safe, comfortable, successful. But looking at it now, I wondered if it had also been lonely. You weren't selfish, I said, settling onto her white leather couch. You were just working with incomplete information. Zadie sat across from me, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Why didn't you tell me? About Somalia, about the torture, about the families you saved. Did you think I couldn't handle it? The question I had been dreading and expecting in equal measure. I thought you deserved to have a normal childhood, I said slowly. To believe that the world was basically safe, that monsters only existed in fairy tales, that your mother was just an ordinary woman who loved you more than anything else in the world. But I didn't believe the world was safe, Zadie said. her voice breaking slightly. "I believed that you didn't love me enough to prioritize me. I thought you worked nights because you were avoiding me. That you lived modestly because you didn't care enough to try for something better." The words hit me like physical blows. All my careful protection, all my efforts to give her stability and normalcy, and she had interpreted them as evidence of my indifference. "I loved you so much that I gave up everything else," I whispered. "My career, my identity, my sense of purpose. I became a different person because I thought that's what you needed." Zadie was crying again, tears streaming down her face. "And I became a person who was ashamed of the woman who sacrificed everything for me. God, Mom, what kind of monster does that make me?" I moved to sit beside her on the couch, pulling her into my arms the way I had when she was small and the world felt too big and frightening. "It makes you human," I said into her hair. "It makes you my daughter, who I love exactly as you are, complicated feelings and all." We sat there for a long time, holding each other while 30 years of misunderstanding slowly began to dissolve. Finally, Zadie pulled back to look at me. "Are you going to take the job?" she asked. I thought about the envelope in my purse, about Hassan's offer, about the chance to return to work that might actually matter on a global scale. "I don't know," I said honestly. "It would mean traveling, being away sometimes, returning to a world that you've never been part of." Zadie was quiet for a moment, then she surprised me with a small smile. "Actually, I might be part of it after all." 6 months later, I stood in the main operations center of the Al-Rashid Foundation's headquarters in Geneva, watching a wall of monitors that displayed crisis situations unfolding across 3 continents. In the past half year, we had evacuated 237 aid workers from a civil war in Sudan, established emergency medical clinics for earthquake victims in Turkey, and coordinated food distribution for over 50,000 refugees displaced by flooding in Bangladesh. But today's operation was different. Today was personal. "Mom, we have confirmation from the field team in Myanmar." Zadie's voice came through my headset, clear and professional. "The extraction vehicles are in position, and the diplomatic channels you opened are holding. We're go for the rescue operation." I looked across the operations center to where my daughter sat surrounded by multiple computer screens, her fingers flying across keyboards as she coordinated real-time intelligence from a dozen different sources. In 6 months, she had transformed from a struggling technology consultant into one of the most effective crisis communication specialists I had ever worked with. "Copy that," I replied into my headset. "Tell the field team they are cleared to proceed." "And Zadie?" "Yes, excellent work." I saw her smile briefly before turning back to her screens. The relationship between us had changed in ways I never could have imagined. We were no longer just mother and daughter carrying decades of misunderstood sacrifices. We were partners, colleagues, equals in work that mattered more than either of us had dreamed possible. The Myanmar operation was our most ambitious yet, evacuating a group of political dissidents and their families who had been marked for execution by the military government. It was exactly the kind of work I had done decades ago. But now I had resources, backup, and most importantly, I had Zadie working alongside me. "Mrs. Morrison," came Ahmad al-Mahmoud's voice from the conference area where our board members were monitoring the operation. "The Lebanese government has confirmed that their airfield is ready to receive our transport planes. Your diplomatic contacts came through perfectly." I nodded, watching the Myanmar situation unfold on the main screen. 3 years ago, these dissidents would have been abandoned by official channels, left to face imprisonment or death, because their rescue would have been too politically sensitive for government agencies. But the Al-Rashid Foundation operated outside those constraints. We could take risks that diplomats couldn't, move faster than bureaucracies allowed, and save lives that would otherwise be lost to political calculations. "Transport 1 is airborne," Zadie announced. 18 passengers safely aboard, including 7 children. ETA to Beirut is 4 hours and 23 minutes. A cheer went up from the operations team, but I felt the familiar mixture of relief and exhaustion that came with successful extractions. Another group of families would live to see tomorrow because we had been willing to act when others hesitated. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sheik Hassan, who was traveling in Qatar, watching the Myanmar operation from Doha. Magnificent work, as always. Your parents would be proud. I smiled at the reference. Hassan had taken to describing all the people we saved as my parents. A reminder that every life we rescued was someone's child, someone's parent, someone who mattered to others the way his family had mattered to him when I pulled them out of Damascus 30 years ago. Mom? Zadie's voice came through the headset again, but this time there was something different in her tone. Can you come over here for a minute? I walked over to her workstation, noting the slight frown of concentration on her face as she studied one of her monitors. What is it? I've been analyzing the intelligence patterns from our recent operations, she said, gesturing at a complex data visualization on her screen. Somalia, Myanmar, Sudan, the earthquake response in Turkey. There's something connecting them that I don't think is coincidental. I leaned closer, studying the web of connections she had mapped out. What kind of connections? Information sources. The intelligence that led us to these crises didn't come through official channels. Someone has been feeding us information about situations that needed our intervention. Someone with access to high-level intelligence from multiple governments. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. Show me. Zadie pulled up a series of communications logs, highlighting specific data points. Look at the timing. In each case, we received actionable intelligence 24 to 48 hours before any government agency became aware of the situation. That's not possible unless someone with extraordinary access was deliberately guiding our operations. I stared at the patterns on the screen, recognizing something that I hoped I was wrong about. Have you identified the source? Not directly, but I can tell you that the information is coming through at least 6 different cover channels, all of them sophisticated enough to suggest intelligence service backing. My phone rang suddenly, an unknown number with a country code I recognized. Somalia. Evelyn Morrison, I answered, my voice carefully neutral. Hello, Evelyn. It's been a long time. The voice sent ice through my veins. Colonel Marcus Webb, my former handler at the State Department. The man who had recruited me for the Somalia mission. The man whose poor intelligence had gotten me captured and tortured for 17 days. Marcus, I said, aware that everyone in the operations center was now watching me. What an unexpected surprise. I need to see you. There are things about your current work that you need to understand. I'm listening. Not over the phone. Can you meet me in Prague tomorrow? The Diplomat Hotel, 2 o'clock. I felt Zadie's hand on my arm, her eyes wide with concern. She couldn't hear his side of the conversation, but my body language was apparently communicating enough. Why Prague? I asked. Because it's neutral ground, and because what I have to tell you involves your foundation's operations in ways you haven't realized. The line went dead. I stood there holding my phone, feeling 30 years of carefully buried fears clawing their way back to the surface. Mom? Zadie's voice was soft but urgent. Who was that? I looked around the operations center, at the monitors showing our successful rescue operation, at the staff members who had dedicated themselves to our humanitarian mission, at the daughter who had found her purpose working alongside me. Someone from my past, I said. Someone I hoped never to hear from again. 24 hours later, I sat in the ornate lobby of the Diplomat Hotel in Prague, watching tourists and business travelers move through the marble-floored space while I waited for a conversation that could change everything I thought I knew about my new life. Marcus Webb appeared precisely at 2 o'clock, looking older, but still carrying himself with the military bearing that had once made him one of the most respected intelligence officers in the State Department. His hair was completely gray now, his face lined with decades of difficult decisions, but his eyes were still sharp and calculating. Evelyn, he said, settling into the chair across from me. You look well. The humanitarian life agrees with you. Cut the pleasantries, Marcus. Why am I here? He smiled slightly, an expression I remembered from our working relationship. The smile of someone who knew more than they were revealing. Your foundation has been remarkably successful in identifying crisis situations before they become public knowledge, he said, remarkably successful in obtaining the exact intelligence needed to mount effective rescue operations. One might almost think you had access to classified government information. I kept my expression neutral, though my heart was racing. The Al-Rashid Foundation has excellent sources. When you save lives, people remember. They share information when it might help save more lives. Indeed, and some of those people now work for intelligence services throughout the Middle East and Europe. People whose lives you saved 30 years ago, who have spent their careers in positions where they could return the favor. The implication hit me like a physical blow. You're saying our intelligence sources are former refugees you rescued, their children, their relatives? People who have built careers in government service specifically so they could support your work. Marcus leaned forward. Evelyn, you didn't just save individual lives 3 decades ago. You created a network of obligation and gratitude that spans continents. I thought about Hassan, about the other men who had found me 6 months ago, about their resources, their connections, their ability to fund operations that governments couldn't or wouldn't support. What do you want, Marcus? I want to offer you something that your foundation currently lacks: official support, legal protection, the ability to operate with full government backing when the situations call for it. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder marked with classified stamps. The intelligence community has been watching your work for months. You're doing what we used to do, but better, faster, without the political constraints that hamstring official operations. And we want to offer you a partnership, not oversight, partnership. Access to official intelligence streams, diplomatic immunity for your operations, backup support when things go wrong. In exchange, occasionally we would ask for your help with situations where official intervention would be politically impossible. I stared at the folder, recognizing the weight of the decision he was asking me to make. You want me to become an unofficial arm of American intelligence services. I want you to become what you always were meant to be. Someone who saves lives when the system fails, but with better resources and legal protection than you had before. I thought about Zadie, about our work together, about the lives we had already saved, about the possibility of saving even more with official backing, but also about the compromises that might come with government partnership. I need to discuss this with my team, I said finally. Marcus nodded and stood up. Of course, but Evelyn, the world is becoming more dangerous, not less. The work you're doing matters more than ever. Don't let pride or past grievances prevent you from accepting help that could save thousands of additional lives. As I watched him walk away, I realized that my journey had come full circle. From diplomat to mother to humanitarian leader, and now back to a position where I could shape international events. But this time, I wouldn't be walking into the darkness alone. This time, I had Zadie beside me and a network of gratitude that spanned the globe. I pulled out my phone and texted my daughter, "Come to Prague. There's something we need to discuss about our future." Her response came immediately, "Already booking my flight. Whatever it is, we'll handle it together." For the first time in 30 years, I felt truly complete. I had reclaimed my purpose, rebuilt my relationship with my daughter, and created something that mattered on a global scale. And now, I had the chance to take it even further. The woman who had been humiliated in a conference room 6 months ago was gone. In her place stood someone who could save lives, protect families, and change the world. With her daughter as her partner and the gratitude of nations as her strength. I had finally become who I was always meant to be. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.